Today we'll be covering the core function of assessment. Per the core function definition, an assessment is those procedures by which a counselor or program identifies and evaluates an individual's strengths, weaknesses, problems, and needs for the development of the treatment plan. An assessment has several goals. It serves to address key life areas, obtain details and background information pertaining to each area, and develop more understanding of how addiction impacts these key areas and how the areas influence each other. In addition, the assessment is often the time the provider can identify any stressors or needs not being met, as well as resources which may be helpful. The provider can then make any appropriate referrals to help address these stressors and needs. An assessment generally builds on the information that was obtained in the screening in order for the treatment professional to get a more holistic understanding of the client. The assessment process can vary depending on the purpose of the assessment. For example, many court-related assessments are done once and are expected to be very thorough. So in this format, it is not uncommon for an assessment appointment to be around 3 hours or more. However, for agency services such as outpatient treatment, often initial assessment will be 1.5 hours. Due to the varying time frame and format that occur, it is important to give an overview to the client related to what an assessment is, as well as the time needed for the assessment process. The text creates an assessment by looking at specific dimension areas. Dimensions 1 through 8 correspond to a specific life area of information for the client, such as presenting issue, family history, medical history, etc. When completing these assessment areas, the focus is on obtaining the client's own perspective and self-report in each of these areas. So, during an assessment, a large percentage of the time is given to the client to simply share their story and perspective on each of the key areas. To do this, the process of obtaining this for an assessment usually works best when you use open-ended questions and go with the client's flow. This is instead of a format where one expects to go through each dimension in a linear manner, meaning strictly going from dimension 1 to dimension 2, dimension 3, etc. Assessments do generally start by discussing the issue that is causing the client to seek services. However, as the client starts to share this, it is best to let the client open up and talk about the other dimension areas in a way that they feel most natural and comfortable instead of directing them. Usually, as the client shares more information, they typically will elaborate on these key areas based on comfort level and what makes the most sense based on their life experience. For example, discussion on the presenting issue can often lead the client to a desire to share information next related to family issues, which can then lead to a discussion on social support. Often a simple prompt such as "tell me more about your family," after a client mentions something simple such as "I live with my sister," can guide the assessment while still allowing the client control over how the information is being revealed. One reason for ensuring that the client is comfortable and not pressured is that you are likely to get more detailed and accurate information when a client feels comfortable and in control of sharing the information and unveiling their life story. Likewise, if you touch on an area that seems especially stressful or traumatic for the client, if possible, it is often best to refrain from pressuring the client too much, as this may end up becoming a stressor or a triggering event for the client. For regular treatment services which will involve follow-up sessions, you will generally have more time to explore any area in the future as the client begins to feel more comfortable. During the assessment, if some areas are not covered or need elaboration, the best time to return to an area or ask additional questions is often near the end of the session. At that time, you can gently use a prompt of, "One area I'd like to get more information on is," or "One area I'd like to return to just for some additional information is." Waiting to address areas or more information that the client has not brought up on their own allows for more trust and comfort to build. This in turn can help the client feel more comfortable, at ease, and willing to address those areas. When completing an assessment, it can be helpful to keep in mind a few things. First, while listening to the information that the client shares during the assessment process, it is important to take a strengths-based approach. This means that as you are listening to what is being shared, you are paying attention to and looking for the strengths and resources of the client. For example, while it is necessary to identify the struggles and need for services which brings the client to your agency, it is equally vital to note positives within their life, their hopes, times where they have overcome obstacles and adversity, and all the strengths the client demonstrates. This allows for a balanced assessment which focuses on identifying the treatment services that can best match what the client needs, as well as the assets and strengths of the clients that can be built on during the treatment process. Second, while the text discusses making sure to include cultural and spiritual information in Dimension 8, as a treatment professional, it is best to be very mindful of important cultural factors, needs, and values for a client throughout the entire assessment process, not just for one dimension. Third, while the focus for an assessment prior to the start of treatment services is to gain as much information as possible, it is very common that an assessment is more ongoing and unfolding throughout treatment services. This is due to a client opening up more as they begin to feel more comfortable with a provider. Most agencies understand this and have an expectation that the treatment provider will be adding more information to the initial assessment as they learn more about the client. Now we'll look more closely at the dimension areas referred to in the text. We will cover dimensions 1 through 8 in this PowerPoint and address dimensions 9 through 10 in the next PowerPoint. With the text format, dimensions 1 through 8 cover information pertaining to the client's life areas. As you can see, there are many key areas to cover in an assessment in order to get a more in-depth view of the person. In addition to the key information related to each area, it is also important to capture how substance use and addiction has influenced and impacted each area together. Starting first with Dimension 1, this looks at what is bringing the client in for services. For example, did they decide to seek treatment? Was it due to family request or court issues? Understanding the initial issue and the referral source is part of Dimension 1. In addition, you would want to obtain information on the client's own perspective and view on the presenting issue. Do they see substance use as a problem? Is seeking treatment a priority? And more importantly, what are their own goals and hopes with services? Turning to Dimension 2, this looks at background information. It can be helpful to know how long the client has been struggling with this issue and if any prior treatment was sought by the client. If yes, where and was that useful? This can be the area to get the client's own reflections on if the past treatment was helpful in any way. Moving to Dimension 3, this is an area that you will build on from the screening. It looks more closely at the substance use now and in the past. Generally, you want to get a more detailed look at each substance the client has used. In addition, you want to get the sub-areas listed on this slide, such as frequency, first use, last use, etc. Often, for this area, a chart can be the most helpful. I've included a short chart of what that might look like pertaining to the substance or behavior, first use, last use, general pattern of use, including amount and frequency, as well as route of administration. In addition, this would also be the area to get information on risks, such as overdose, withdrawal symptoms, as well as information pertaining to the family history of addiction. Dimension 4 refers to medical information. Here you will obtain the information on this slide related to both the client and their family. Along with this dimension is Dimension 5, which looks at current basic needs such as housing, food, clothing, and what is not being met. This area also covers activities of daily living, or ADLs, that the client may be struggling with. For example, are they capable of living alone and taking care of their basic needs? Often, needs in Dimensions 4 and 5 will continue to prompt the treatment provider to make a referral to an outside community agency that works with needs related to this area. Turning now to Dimension 6, this area addresses mental health issues and psychological functioning. This is the area to document information presented on this slide. When documenting information in this area, include the client's perspective on the history and how addiction has impacted the mental health issues. Also, any current or past traumatic events are often included in this area. However, some assessment formats put trauma history as its own category. This is because many clients may have a long history of trauma, including what is referred to as adverse childhood experiences, multiple traumatic events, and domestic violence issue. Due to this, often the trauma history is best addressed as its own area. Dimension 7 is used to gain more information regarding the family structure and family relationships. Here is where you get specifics on who is part of the family, where family members live, how much contact occurs, as well as the client's perspective on their family and its influence. For this area, it is critical to allow the person to share who they feel makes up their family, not just who might be included in a family from a traditional sense. For example, if a client notes that a neighbor is more like a parent or a sibling than just a neighbor, it is important to note that, include that under Dimension 7. Looking at Dimension 8, the overall information in this area pertains to community and environmental contexts. It also includes the person's current environments, their connection to any community, cultural, spiritual resources, and both the influence and impact these environments have on the client. Given that Dimension 8 covers a broad number of areas, these are often broken down into subdimensions. These include cultural spiritual issues, including the values and strengths related to the subdimension, social class, social relationships, and legal history. Most assessments will also include information related to vocational and educational history under this dimension area. So that covers the key life areas generally covered in an assessment. When obtaining information for these dimensions, the text includes some specific questions to reflect on for each area. The text suggests using these questions as a guide to complete each area thoroughly. Being able to answer the questions helps to ensure that you will have covered enough information in that dimension. Doing so will help a provider to use the assessment to create an effective service plan.